On July 4th, 1850, the United States celebrated the 74th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. There were speeches and barbecues in town squares and commons, public readings of the Declaration, brass bands, fireworks, people shooting guns, and a lot of drinking. In Washington, D.C., in the early afternoon, President Zachary Taylor attended a ceremony to lay the cornerstone for the future Washington Monument. Henry S. Foote, senator from Mississippi, gave an hour-long address. It was a very hot and muggy day. Eventually, the president walked back to the White House, where he reportedly ate a lot of green apples and a huge bowl of cherries. He also drank a lot of cold milk. By evening, he was suffering from severe indigestion, gastroenteritis. The next day, July 5th, it seemed to get better. The day after that, July 6th, the Saturday, he was well enough to sit at his desk and signed, among other things, the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty between the U.S. and Great Britain, which related to Central America and plans to build a canal across it. But the next day, Taylor's condition worsened severely. It's not entirely certain what it was. White House doctors diagnosed it as something called cholera morbus, which is not a term recognized by modern medical science and isn't the same as the disease commonly known as cholera. He wasn't the only one affected with similar symptoms. Various other politicians, including John Clayton, Secretary of State, who had negotiated that treaty, George Crawford, Secretary of War, and William Seward, Senator from New York, were down with apparently the same condition at that same time. Washington, having been built on a swamp, was notoriously unhealthy. Its drinking water was virtually toxic. People who lived there pooped their guts out on a regular basis, especially in summer. But Taylor, age 65, was particularly badly stricken and not very resilient. As his condition worsened, he told doctors and his wife that he thought he was going to die. At 10:35 p.m. on Tuesday, July 9th, 1850, he did. He was only the second U.S. president to die in office. Zachary Taylor had been president for 16 months. No, he was not secretly murdered. I'll talk about that issue briefly at the very end of the video. Zachary Taylor's surprise death meant that also for the second time, the sitting vice president ascended to the big chair. In the summer of 1850, Millard Fillmore of New York State was, like many vice presidents before him, something of an unknown quantity. He was a member of the Whig Party, which theoretically stood for various principles, but Fillmore hadn't been a national figure before 1848 when he was chosen as Taylor's running mate. And he had made little impact as vice president. No one was sure what his policy positions were, or even who he really was. But the next day, after Taylor's death, on July 10, 1850, Millard Fillmore took the oath of office in the U.S. House of Representatives chamber at the Capitol, becoming the 13th U.S. president. You could definitely call Taylor's death a black swan event, a rare, unpredictable twist that had huge and far-reaching consequences. You see, during the summer of 1850, a package of proposed legislation was working its way through Congress. Its champions, including elder statesman Daniel Webster, intended it to be a final settlement of the biggest question dividing America at that time, slavery. Taylor had been against most of what would eventually become the Compromise of 1850. Fillmore, however, was in favor of it. The Compromise of 1850 was not the final settlement of the slavery issue. In fact, many historians, including me, believe it hastened rather than postponed the coming of the Civil War a bit more than 10 years later. Even with his pivotal role in bringing about the Compromise of 1850, Millard Fillmore remains to this day possibly the most obscure man ever to hold the office of U.S. president. His obscurity is literally a punchline. Today in the 21st century, probably more Americans have heard of the notoriously unfunny comic strip Millard Fillmore, which other than the name has nothing to do with him, than have heard of the real person. Fillmore is, however, definitely worth studying. Once you delve into who he was, what he stood for, and how he went about exercising the immense power that fell rather unexpectedly into his lap, you can understand a lot about the complicated political and social picture of America in 1850. And Fillmore himself doesn't come out of the story smelling too good. He was, in fact, a believer in a lot of the strange and ugly ideas that were floating around in mid-19th century America. Ideas that defined, for better or worse, his legacy, or lack thereof. This video is the story of Millard Fillmore, the conspiracy theorist president. Hi, I'm Sean Munger, historian. I have a PhD in history, and my niche here on YouTube is doing long, context-heavy deep dives into various historical subjects. This video is the third one I've done on fairly obscure US presidents of the 19th century, who I feel, whatever their accomplishments and personal stories, deserve some more study than they usually receive. Back in 2023, I did a video on Franklin Pierce, the 14th president, and a year later I profiled James Garfield. If you're familiar with those, you might have been able to predict that I'd get around to Fillmore sooner or later. When a historian takes on one of these obscure presidents, especially one of the pre-Civil War ones, their goal is often to try to rehabilitate their reputations, to say essentially, hey, this guy wasn't as bad as everybody thinks. I just want to be clear that that is not going to be my approach to Millard Fillmore. He is, however, definitely worth studying. In fact, the study of Fillmore is so intricately intertwined with the broader history of the Whig Party, which was briefly one of the two main political parties in the US, that you can't separate them. You also can't separate Fillmore from the subject of the conspiracy paranoia that was sweeping the United States in the 1850s, and with which Fillmore enthusiastically identified himself. That's why I call him the conspiracy theorist president. There is a member section on my channel where you can see a version of this video ad-free and without the occasional redactions that I sometimes have to do to satisfy ad-friendly guidelines. In a moment, we'll get back to a brief profile of Fillmore's very first days in office and the tumultuous backdrop against which he became president. Then, even before we go back to fill in more of his backstory and early life, we have a lot of context to get through. Bear with me. Millard Fillmore was a conspiracy theorist. Almost all conspiracy theories involve paranoia, an irrational fear of something. But as most of us know, there's a fine line between irrational fear and justified concern. Part of the reason why conspiracy theories flourish today is because there is a lot out there to be genuinely wary of. One of the things that I've become concerned about, especially in the past few months, is online security and privacy. It's not paranoia to think that someone may be watching what you do online. This is why I use a VPN to access the internet. It's the best way to increase online security. Specifically, I use private internet access, a VPN service that I think really stands out from the others. VPN stands for Virtual Private Network. It's an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through basically an encrypted tunnel. It's especially good if you're connecting on a public Wi-Fi network or on one that's not yours, such as an airport, coffee shop, library, or friend's house. One thing that stands out about private internet access is that it has a strict no logs policy. That means they don't record or store user data. And that's not just bluster. Private internet access has had this policy vetted in court and also by third-party auditors. This is what really sold me on them. You can get private internet access for all platforms, Windows, Mac, Android, whatever, and use it on an unlimited number of devices at the same time. An added benefit, while using the VPN, you can access streaming services, websites, and content unavailable in various countries by giving you the option to change your IP address to any one of 91 countries. If we're talking about paranoid US presidents, there's a great movie about that, the classic 1976 thriller, All the President's Men. Unless you're on HBO Max, this film is hard to find on streaming. If you're on Amazon Prime, for instance, as of now, the only country you could watch it in is Portugal. But with a VPN, you can change your apparent country of origin to whatever it needs to be so you can see it, no problem. This can also help with research to get access to materials you wouldn't otherwise have access to. If you go to this link, piavpn.com/Sean Munger, you can get 83% off, which comes out to $2.03 a month, a huge savings, and you get 4 months free. Go to the link, or you can just scan the QR code on the screen there. Private internet access can help you use the technology of the internet safely. My thanks to them for sponsoring this video. Now back to Millard Fillmore and his presidency. At the time of Taylor's death, Fillmore had been living at the famous Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C. He spent most of his time presiding over the Senate. He had been told the previous evening that the president was dying. Once he was sworn in, he told Taylor's widow, Margaret, that she could stay in the White House as long as she needed to get her affairs in order, but she moved out within 3 days. The death of a sitting president had occurred only once before in American history, as I said, 9 years earlier, in 1841, when William Henry Harrison, the first Whig, W-H-I-G, to be elected, died a month into his term. A major question at that time was what the cabinet should do. In July 1850, following the precedent set by Harrison's cabinet in 1841, each of Taylor's cabinet members, there were 7 at that time, handed in their resignations. They didn't really expect to quit. This was a gesture of courtesy to the incoming president, and each of them expected that Fillmore would keep them on, if not through his own term, at least long enough so that Fillmore could choose his own man and make a smooth transition. Fillmore, however, accepted their resignations, all 7 of them. Why did he do this? Well, it seems to have been personal. Taylor hadn't included Fillmore in very much government business and didn't invite him to cabinet meetings. Fillmore seems to have taken this personally, and firing the cabinet was a measure of revenge. The gap in cabinet continuity was a handicap because Fillmore was facing several crises right off the bat. One was the Compromise of 1850, which I'll get to in just a minute. Another was a claim by the state of Texas, which had been problematic for the United States throughout the 1830s and 1840s. In 1850, the governor of Texas, Peter Bell, demanded a whole bunch more of Texas, including most of present-day New Mexico, than had been agreed when the state was admitted to the Union in 1845. The real issue here, of course, was slavery. It was legal in Texas and illegal in New Mexico territory. New Mexico was, in 1850, trying to become a state, and its residents had drafted a constitution. Fillmore should have told Governor Bell to talk to the hand. Only Congress could set a state's boundaries, and the United States Army had the authority to enforce them. But Fillmore didn't do that. When he could have acted with a strong Secretary of the Interior and Secretary of War, those positions were vacant for several critical weeks. Eventually, the Texas issue got sucked up in the Michigas over the broader Compromise of 1850. I'm going to talk more about the Compromise in Chapter 6. Suffice it to say, this was a big package of legislation, advanced chiefly by Henry Clay, Whig senator from Kentucky, whose backers hoped would settle the issue of slavery in America once and for all. The central controversy was basically about whether a huge chunk of territory that the United States had conquered from Mexico in the recent Mexican-American War could come into the Union with or without slavery allowed. This territorial acquisition had basically blown up the fragile set of previous compromises over slavery that had been forged during the 1820s and 1830s. Simplifying just a little bit, again, I'm going to get into more detail in Chapter 6. There were essentially 2 versions of a potential compromise on the table. One favored by President Taylor, the other by Henry Clay. But in July 1850, Taylor was now pushing up daisies, and Fillmore had, even before Taylor died, trashed the idea of his version of the compromise. Clay's version was falling apart in Congress at the moment Zachary Taylor reached for that fateful bowl of cherries. But in the later summer of 1850, as the Senate scrambled to confirm Fillmore's hasty cabinet replacements, a new star in the Senate, Stephen Douglas, Democrat from Illinois, rescued Clay's version of the compromise by breaking it into pieces and building shifting political coalitions to pass each individual part of it separately. Fillmore seems to have thought that his process of assembling a new cabinet would help unite the Whig Party, which was split over the compromise. It didn't go so well. He had trouble finding people who would agree to join his cabinet. For each of Secretary of War and Secretary of the Interior, it took him 3 tries to get a nominee who would do it and who wasn't politically problematic. Most of Fillmore's cabinet picks ended up being either pro-slavery, like John Crittenden, new Attorney General, or lukewarm enough on slavery to theoretically not offend either the northern or southern wings of the Whig Party, with one exception. As Secretary of State, Fillmore chose the legendary Massachusetts statesman and orator Daniel Webster, a known and forceful opponent of slavery. On the surface, this seemed like a masterstroke. Webster was very well respected, and he had experience. He had been Secretary of State before. But 1850 was the very end of his career, and things weren't going so great for him. Earlier in the year, Webster had given a well-publicized speech in favor of Clay's version of the compromise, which anti-slavery people in the North interpreted as a total sellout on the issue. So why did he take the job at all? Webster seems to have been angling to be elected president in 1852. Not too likely, as we'll see. On September 9th, 1850, Fillmore signed several bills into law that were part of the Grand Compromise. 9 days later, he signed the Fugitive Slave Act, which was destined to be the major project of his administration. Taylor's death and Fillmore's accession to the big chair had completely changed the political game and allowed what was, with some changes, basically Clay's version of the compromise to pass. It did not settle the issue of slavery. In fact, it was like pouring gasoline on a fire. Now, we're already pretty deep into the politics of Fillmore's presidency, and I haven't told you anything much about his background yet, or about the very complicated context of all of these events. Let's turn to the context next. I am going to go back and trace Fillmore's background and early life, but not until Chapter 3. Without a doubt, the main issue in the early American Republic was slavery. You could say that the original sin of the American Republic is that it was founded upon breaking away from Great Britain in the Revolution with the institution of slavery still intact. The most common historical interpretation of this period is that slavery couldn't have been abolished during the Revolution or the creation of the Constitution because the Southern states wouldn't have been willing to join the new Union unless slavery was protected. I'm in a minority of historians who reject this view. There's very little evidence that this is in fact what would have happened. In any event, the political elite that led the American Revolution and drafted the Constitution was too willing to profit from slavery to want to try seriously to eliminate it. Now, the purpose of this video is not to try to defend that minority view. I might do a video on it eventually, I might not, but that's for another day. What is clear is that dealing with slavery was the perennial problem of the early decades of the Republic. What was also going on in this period was that there was a very rough transition of leadership from the generation who had taken part in the American Revolution and whoever was destined to inherit leadership once the revolutionary generation died off. The first 5 U.S. presidents were members of that revolutionary generation and had actively participated in the revolutionary project in one way or another. The 6th, John Quincy Adams, was a kid during the Revolution proper, but he was connected to the founding generation by being the son of one of the most important revolutionaries, the elder John Adams. Then, in the mid-1820s, Andrew Jackson, who had been a young teenager at the tail end of the Revolutionary War, came to political prominence. Jackson was the whole reason the Whig Party began in the first place. The old Democratic-Republican Party, which had held most national-level power in the U.S. since 1800, began to splinter during the tumultuous single term of John Quincy Adams, who was elected by the House of Representatives in 1825, when no presidential candidate got a majority of electoral votes. A major problem which kept coming up over and over again involved expansion of U.S. territory and whether slavery would be allowed or prohibited there. This would ultimately determine how many slave states and free states there would be in the Union, which expanded every few years with the admission of one or more states. In 1819, before Jackson came to power, a crisis erupted over Missouri. After fulminating for a couple of months, Congress worked out the delicate Missouri Compromise of 1820. This compromise drew a line across the remainder of as yet unorganized federal territory, coinciding with the southern border of Missouri. Above the line, slavery would be prohibited, except in Missouri, strangely enough, and below it, it would be allowed. This supposedly meant that slavery would eventually die out, or at least that despite the initial balance between the number of slave states and free states in the Senate, when Maine was admitted as a free state at the same time as Missouri, as time went on, supposedly free states would outnumber slave states. One of the main architects of this compromise was Henry Clay, then Speaker of the House of Representatives. Clay was one of the leading politicians in this period, but he always had his eye on the White House and spent most of his career trying to get there. Anyway, back to Andrew Jackson. A genocidal maniac bent on the forcible removal of Native Americans from the Southeast so as to open up prime farmlands for development as slave plantations, Jackson forced through numerous policies that were deeply controversial. Not just the aforementioned Indian Removal Act, which eventually fell to his successor Martin Van Buren to implement, but also hostility to a national bank, disinterest in funding internal improvements like canals and roads, and the spoils system, rewarding party loyalists with political appointments. Jackson drove his detractors crazy, and especially after he won re-election, defeating Henry Clay of all people, his political opponents began to coalesce into a new party. This was the start of what's referred to as the second party system. If you need a primer on the various party systems in American history, I'll refer you to a very good video by Mr. Beat on that subject. The new party called themselves Whigs. That name was a throwback to the American Revolution, where people in favor of breaking away from Britain were known as Whigs, in opposition to Tories or Loyalists. The name of the party was meant, in 1833, to imply that Jackson was acting too much like a king, especially with his use of the veto, which was perfectly constitutional, as a policy tool. Jackson, who despite his political bluster was a tiny, feeble, and extremely unhealthy man, retired and handpicked as his successor Martin Van Buren of New York, then vice president. Much to the horror of the new Whig Party, Van Buren was handily elected in 1836. This was truly the generational transition I was talking about earlier. Van Buren was the first president to be born after the Declaration of Independence. With the retirement of Jackson, the last Revolutionary War veteran, and just barely the last member of the revolutionary generation, leadership passed to a younger clique, made up mostly of professional party politicians. The triumvirate who dominated congressional politics in this period, Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and John C. Calhoun, were exemplars of this successor generation. Conspiracy theories and conspiracy thinking were major factors in early 19th century American politics. I go into this subject in much more depth in the online class available on my website about the history of conspiracy theories in America. It's worth mentioning that conspiracy theories aren't just disconnected narratives about particular events. Conspiracy as a belief system is an alternative explanation for how history works, which is opposite from and at odds with the field of documentary and scholarly history. And it's at the root of why conspiracy theorists tend to hate historians. The conspiracy mode of thinking basically posits that nothing in the world is a coincidence, and history is carefully and deliberately directed from behind the scenes by a shadowy cabal of bad people who want to do bad things in the world. Conspiracy thinking was a major factor in the American Revolution. Many among the revolutionary generation saw at the root of the British Crown's mistreatment of the American colonies a deliberate plot to oppress and destroy the colonies, if not by King George III, by others around him, especially the Earl of Bute, John Stuart, who had been prime minister briefly in 1762 and 1763. The Illuminati was founded as a secret society in Bavaria in 1776, dedicated to progressive and rationalist ideals. Although it had very little actual power and was in any event banned by the Bavarian government less than a decade later, this organization, modeled on the Freemasons, looked incredibly sinister to many people. Despite not actually existing after 1785, it continued to be blamed by conspiracy theorists for almost everything over the next 200 years and even into our own time. An incredible testament to how difficult it is to refute conspiracy fantasies in the popular consciousness. In 1798, theologian Jedediah Morse, the father of the guy who invented the telegraph, began preaching from the pulpit about the Illuminati and the Freemasons and how they had supposedly engineered the French Revolution to destroy Western civilization. His son Samuel, yes, the guy who invented the telegraph, published a book in 1835 called Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States. That title should be self-explanatory. Samuel Morse believed that the Habsburg dynasty of Austria, a deeply Catholic country, was deploying the Jesuits as a secret fifth column to try to take over the United States. Both Morses, father and son, were strongly anti-Catholic. Samuel Morse was also strongly pro-slavery, believing it was perfectly ethical, moral, and godly. Anti-Catholicism was a huge movement in America of this period. There were some enclaves of Catholics in the American colonies, and there was an early wave of Catholic immigration to the new United States during and after the 1798 revolt in Ireland against the British. But the factor that really made anti-Catholicism take off was the next wave of Irish immigration to the U.S., particularly in the 1840s, when hundreds of thousands of Irish, almost all of them Catholic, came to American shores in the wake of the potato famine. That wasn't the cause of anti-Catholic sentiment or conspiracy theories about them. That was just the gasoline sprayed on the fire that made anti-Catholicism a political movement, especially in large cities in the Northeast like New York and Boston, where Irish Catholics tended to settle. Earlier than that, beginning in the first decade of the 19th century, a Protestant religious revival had gotten going, called the Second Great Awakening. This was centered especially in central and upper New York State, exactly the region that Millard Fillmore and his family came from. In the 18-teens, 20s, and 30s, hellfire preachers and leaders of new religious movements were running around up there holding tent revival meetings, founding communes and breakaway communities, and unwittingly tilling the soil, so to speak, such that the seeds of virulent anti-Catholicism and xenophobia would find a very rich environment to grow in. All of this, political upheaval, conspiracy theories, anti-Catholicism, anti-Masonic sentiment, religious revival, and large waves of immigration, all of this formed the backdrop of who Millard Fillmore was and where he came from. It's necessary to paint this picture if you want to have any understanding of the man, his politics, and what made him tick. Now that we've done that, let's finally turn our attention to Fillmore's background and origins. This very pretty scene, I see the wormhole effect from my old Franklin Pierce video is back after a long absence, is in a state park near Moravia, New York, called appropriately enough, Fillmore Glen State Park. This location you're looking at is about 500 feet from the site of a log cabin where Millard Fillmore was born on January 7, 1800. The cabin was torn down long ago, and there's a somewhat touristy replica of it on or at least near the site. Fillmore is one of the few U.S. presidents who could truthfully claim to have been born in a log cabin. The Fillmore family was from Vermont. They moved to this part of New York in 1799, hoping the farming conditions would be better. They weren't. After a legal dispute over the boundaries of his land, Nathaniel Fillmore moved his family to this small town. Is it even a town? Thank you, wormhole. Anyway, this place called Sempronius, New York, which isn't far away. You can tell just from what this place looks like 226 years later that there wasn't much here. The Fillmores were pretty poor. Nathaniel was just a dirt farmer. He and his wife Phoebe raised 8 kids, of which Millard, who got that name from his mother's maiden name, was the oldest son. Nathaniel wanted something more for his son, so he apprenticed him out to a local textile mill. Millard hated it. He received some education at a local school called the New Hope Academy. One of the teachers there was Abigail Powers, 2 years older than Millard. They fell in love, but her family didn't like Millard and thought she could do better. About this time, the mill that Millard was apprenticed to, I can't believe I managed to say that sentence, closed for a time. seeking other work. His dad got him another apprenticeship with a county judge, Walter Wood, as a law clerk. That was how people became lawyers in the early 19th century. Fillmore had to go back to the mill when it reopened, but he eventually bought out his apprenticeship and returned to work for Judge Wood. Only he ended up hating this too, and he didn't make much money. Millard, then aged 21, did something a little shady. He accepted some money to take a case to represent a client in front of a local justice of the peace. He hadn't passed the bar, which at that time was not a requirement for practicing law, but it was highly irregular for him to do this without asking his boss, Judge Wood, for permission. When Wood found out about this and blew up at him, Millard got huffy, quit, and went back to his father's farm. After Fillmore was admitted to the bar, despite several better offers to practice law in Buffalo, New York, Fillmore instead decided to move to this town, East Aurora, New York. The wormhole is jumping the gun here a little bit. Millard and Abigail Fillmore did live in this house in East Aurora, now a museum, but they only moved in after their marriage in 1826. Before that, Millard wanted to practice law in this tiny town, probably because it was a tiny town, with no other lawyers to compete with. If you had a legal case in East Aurora, New York, basically you were stuck with Millard Fillmore. Now, this is pretty standard issue early 19th century presidential background stuff. Here is where your standard log cabin country lawyer type story meets the X-Files. The wormhole really wants to take us to a town called Batavia, New York. Not a bad looking little town, again, fairly standard. In the 1820s, a man named William Morgan lived here. He was a bricklayer and stonecutter originally from Virginia, but he had also spent some time in Canada. Apparently he drank a lot. Morgan claimed to be a member of the Freemasons. That's a fraternal organization descended from stonecutters' guilds in medieval Europe that was very popular in the early United States. A sort of gentleman's club with secret handshakes, exclusive lodges, and the kind of secret clubhouse, no girls allowed type stuff that might have appealed to you when you were about 10, except this was for adult men. In reality, the Freemasons were about as sinister as a pile of puppies, but in conspiracy theory-charged early America, the Masons were often treated with suspicion. Anyway, Morgan tried to join some Masonic organizations in Batavia, but they wouldn't take him. He was seen as a drunk and a gambler. Whether he was or not is open to question, but he was definitely butthurt about getting denied. So he stormed off and wrote a book called Freemasonry Exposed that publicly disclosed all of the secret handshake stuff the Masons like to try to keep secret. He managed to secure a publisher for this book, but before it came out, in September 1826, Morgan vanished after having been jailed for a debt, possibly at the behest of local Masons who hated him. William Morgan's disappearance became a huge deal in this part of New York. Especially after the book came out, speculation was rampant that the Masons had put a hit on Morgan as revenge for exposing the order's secrets. When a rotting body washed up on the shores of Lake Ontario a year later, in October 1827, the anti-Masonic conspiracy theories became even more widespread. This despite the fact that there was no proof that moldy old corpse even was Morgan's, much less that he'd been murdered. In 1827 and 1828, in law offices, taverns, and the parlors of private homes, upwardly mobile young men of the Finger Lakes region of New York met to plot a political response to the hated influence of Freemasonry. One of the men drawn into what became the anti-Masonic party was, you guessed it, Millard Fillmore, who had never really been political before this. It's highly significant that his entry into politics was through a fringe party based on a conspiracy theory. In reality, there was more behind the anti-Masonic party than just the tinfoil hats. It was ginned up out of whole cloth for purely political reasons. In between the elections of 1824 and 1828, almost the entirety of American politics was driven by the protracted rematch between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, whose supporters insisted he had won the 1824 election, but it was stolen for Adams by a corrupt bargain in the House of Representatives, engineered by, among others, Henry Clay. Adams faced an uphill climb for re-election in 1828, and if he was going to pull it off, he desperately needed New York. But he wasn't super popular there. So, a powerful newspaper publisher from Albany, Thurlow Weed, who I'll talk about more in the next chapter, needed an issue that would galvanize New York voters and turn them out for Adams in 28. When that rotting body washed up on shore and everybody in western New York State was suddenly raging at the Freemasons, Weed saw the issue that he needed. The anti-Masonic Party was the perfect stalking horse for the pro-Adams movement, whose own political organization, the National Republicans, forerunners of the Whigs, was still pretty unsteady on its feet. It just so happened Andrew Jackson was a Freemason, and the conspiracy theories about the Masons and their supposed secret plots to subvert American democracy pandered perfectly to voters who were unlikely to get fired up to go off and vote for blue blood New England aristocrat John Quincy Adams, but who would happily vote against Andrew Jackson to punish those evil Masons. Was Fillmore a true believer in the anti-Masonic cause, or was he just going with the flow to seek political office? I think the evidence shows that he was a true believer. He had voted for Adams in 1824, but he showed no real interest in politics before the whole William Morgan thing blew up. By 1828, though, he was a delegate to 2 anti-Masonic Party conventions in New York, and he also attended the National Republican Convention in the state to nominate Adams for president. It didn't work, at least on the national level. Adams was utterly clowned by Jackson in 1828. The election was bad for Adams, but good for Millard Fillmore. He had been nominated for the New York State Legislature on the anti-Masonic ticket, and he won handily. The conspiracy theorist from Sempronius was now a bona fide elected official. Fillmore served 3 one-year terms in the New York State Assembly. He learned some political skills there, and he helped pass some bills, including one that abolished debtors' prisons. He also went up a couple of rungs on the socioeconomic ladder and was able to move his family to Buffalo in 1830. By this time, Millard and Abigail had a son, Millard Powers Fillmore, and a daughter, Mary Abigail, would be born later. In 1831, he took a year off to tend to his law practice, which was becoming successful. The anti-Masonic Party fizzled pretty quickly after its failure in the 1828 elections, but it did serve as the launching pad for 3 of New York State's most important politicians in the period between Jackson's first election and the Civil War. At least among New York politicians who were not Jacksonian Democrats. Fillmore was one of those 3. Another was Thurlow Weed, who I mentioned, and the third was William Seward. I'll talk about them in the next chapter, but for right now, what you need to know is that when the anti-Masonic Party slumped in the early 1830s, these 3 successfully made the transition into the new Whig Party. This was truly the party that should have existed all along to challenge Jackson, if his opponents could have gotten their crap together instead of wasting time spinning weird fantasies about grand Masonic conspiracies. Henry Clay, who would also become a committed Whig, ran against Jackson in the 1832 election, officially on the National Republican ticket. This was the first of Clay's 2, maybe 3 serious bids for president. Jackson utterly destroyed him with 54% of the popular vote. But 1832 was again a good political year for Millard Fillmore, who ran for the U.S. House of Representatives as, well, it's not really clear what he called himself at this time. The anti-Masons still technically existed, as did the National Republicans, but the Whig Party was clearly the next phase of the resistance against Jackson, and Fillmore was totally there for it. At this point, in part because of the rise of the Whig Party, Fillmore's story becomes increasingly intertwined with those 2 other prominent New Yorkers, Thurlow Weed and William Seward. Let's meet them in the next chapter and try to get a handle on what they were all about. Thurlow Weed, born in Greene County, New York, to a family of poor farmers and laborers, worked his way up through a series of odd jobs until he landed in the printing business, a very good business at that time in the early 18-teens. His career was briefly interrupted by the War of 1812, in which he served in the New York State Militia, and then he returned to printing after the war. Newspapers in early 19th century America were intensely political. The idea that news reporting should be fair and politically impartial is an entirely modern conceit. That idea was unknown at the time and would have been thought of as preposterous if it had been known. Newspapers were basically arms of political parties, and you read a newspaper precisely because it espoused the views of the party you followed. Therefore, it's not surprising that Weed got into politics through the newspaper business. His paper, the Rochester Telegraph, came out strongly in support of John Quincy Adams. As we saw in the last chapter, Weed hopped on the conspiracy theory bandwagon in 1827 over the William Morgan mishegas. To be sure, Weed did not invent anti-Masonic sentiment. Some prominent anti-Masons had already been supporting the paper that Weed eventually bought. He made numerous connections in this period that would prove to be politically consequential later down the road. One of these connections came sometime in 1824. A young couple was traveling on a vacation to Niagara Falls when their carriage lost a wheel while passing through Rochester. One of the people who came to the aid of the stranded travelers was Thurlow Weed. The young man in the carriage was William Henry Seward, a young lawyer who had just married his beautiful wife, Frances Miller. As they got to know each other, Weed and Seward found they had a lot in common, such as admiration for J.Q. Adams, hatred for Andrew Jackson, and distrust of the Masons. Seward got into politics too. New York state politics was a soap opera in the 1820s and 30s. One of the most powerful politicians in the state, eventually the head of a large political organization, was Martin Van Buren, but he was a Democrat. And especially after Jackson's election, he became closely associated with the man the anti-Masons loved to hate. This was especially true after Van Buren, who was very ambitious, started insinuating himself into Jackson's inner circle when Jackson alienated his cabinet over a social controversy involving the wives of the cabinet members. A long story I won't get into here. Seward and Weed, who strongly opposed Jackson and Democrats, emerged as basically the co-chairs of the New York state political machine that stood in opposition to Van Buren. Millard Fillmore was definitely a part of this machine, but he kind of stood apart from Weed and Seward in character and temperament, as well as, eventually, in politics. Slavery was part of this. Weed and Seward eventually developed a strong, visceral hatred of slavery on moral grounds. Fillmore opposed it at least nominally, but only in the sort of mild, go-along to get-along kind of way that many New Yorkers did in this period. He never seems to have had a deep moral conviction about the wrongness of slavery. And as we'll see many times in his political career, he was perfectly willing to advance the interests of slave owners. During his initial term in Congress, Fillmore hitched his star to a major player in anti-Jacksonian politics, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, who took him on as sort of a political protege. The 1830s was a period of organizing for the new Whig Party. All of these guys, Weed, Seward, Webster, and Fillmore, quickly became prominent in the new party, though Fillmore was probably the one who came on board the latest. He stood down for re-election in 1834 and finally distanced himself from the now moribund anti-Mason party, but only because it was no longer politically viable. In 1836, Fillmore ran again for Congress, this time as a Whig, and was elected. Within the House of Representatives, he eventually rose to the position of chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. The Whigs were still too new and uncertain to pull off a presidential victory in 1836, although they came surprisingly close. Jackson's homeboy, Martin Van Buren, got barely over 50% of the popular vote, but the opposition had failed to unite against him. The Whigs promoted different candidates in different regions, with William Henry Harrison, the veteran old Indian fighter and ancient war hero, the most popular among them. Upon taking office in early 1837, Van Buren immediately stepped in poo with his inept response to a major economic collapse that was caused, at least in part, by Andrew Jackson's fiscal policies. Van Buren also inherited from Jackson the unenviable task of forcibly relocating Native Americans from the Southeast, which became the Trail of Tears, a major event in the ongoing genocide against Native American nations. In the run-up to the next election in 1840, Whigs frequently attacked Van Buren in the press, giving him the nickname Martin Van Ruin, mocking his response to the Depression. Harrison was again a Whig presidential candidate in 1840, but this time, the Whigs understood the necessity of uniting behind a single guy and working hard to get him elected. Not content merely to flog their platform of economic protectionism, internal improvements, and opposition to Jacksonian ideas, the Whigs associated Harrison with the symbols of the log cabin, despite the fact that he was born in a Virginia mansion built by slaves, and hard cider. Bribing voters with alcohol turned out to be a good electoral strategy. Harrison scored a solid majority of the popular vote and utterly clowned Martin Van Buren, in the Electoral College, 234 votes to 60. The Whigs now had their first president and an electoral mandate. They also did well in Congress, significantly adding to their seats in the House and taking control of the Senate for the first time. At age 69, William Henry Harrison was the oldest president ever elected up until that time. Only a few weeks into his term, Harrison caught pneumonia, though probably not, as popular legend has it, from standing out in the cold delivering his 2-hour inaugural address. He croaked on April 4th, 1841. The first Whig president had been in office exactly a month. There was at the time some mishigas about whether the sitting vice president should, in the event of the president's death, succeed to the office, or whether there should be a special election, or whether he was just the acting president, or something. I don't need to get into that. What's significant is that Harrison's VP, John Tyler of Virginia, fooled everybody because when he came into the White House, he quickly proved he was much more aligned with the Democrats than the Whigs. The Whig Party was utterly furious with him, and you can understand why. I'm not going to go into that either. What was Fillmore doing all this time? Well, after Tyler's accession, Fillmore helped shepherd a bill through Congress that established a very high tariff on imported goods, which Tyler opposed. After 2 rounds of political infighting over the tariff, Tyler finally signed a version of it, but at the cost of alienating most Democrats in Congress, which meant that both parties now hated him. Fillmore had proved himself pretty good at political combat, at least in some respects. In 1842, Fillmore decided not to run for another term. The New York soap opera was heating up again. Seward had become New York's governor in 1839 and had proven strongly anti-slavery, thwarting various policies in the state that made it easier for slave owners to capture runaway slaves. Fillmore was much more in favor of conciliation with slave-owning interests. With Martin Van Ruin out of the picture, at least for a while, New York politics split along 2 axes, the Seward Weed wing and the Fillmore wing. Slavery was the major difference between them. Another major battleground involves schools. New York by this time had a compulsory education law. All kids had to go to school. One of the books kids were forced to read in almost every school was, of course, the Bible. A lot of Catholics were moving into New York in the 1840s, and they argued the state should support Catholic parochial schools, so at least their kids would be able to read a Catholic Bible. Seward generally agreed. You can guess how Fillmore felt about this. He couched his opposition to these measures as separation of church and state. But what he was really doing was opposing any state support for Catholicism and forcing Catholic kids to be taught the Protestant Bible in schools. It was a short step from believing conspiracy theories about the Masons to believing that Catholics were a mortal threat to American democracy, which is what Fillmore believed, as we'll see later on. 1844 was a hard-fought, acrimonious, and pivotal election. Henry Clay was now the leader of the consolidated Whig Party, and he was convinced that he would finally, after a nearly 30-year quest, get the keys to the White House. The Democrats nominated James Polk, who, in addition to having the greatest mullet of the 19th century, was basically a little mini-me clone of Andrew Jackson, except even more extreme. Polk was an aggressive expansionist. He wanted to annex Texas, which had broken away from Mexico in 1836, and ever since had been desperately hoping to become part of the United States as a new slave state. Polk also wanted more territory in the Northwest, putting the U.S. at odds with Britain, who still claimed part of that area. Behind this manifest destiny idea was the truly toxic question. If the U.S. did get more territory, what would be the status of slavery in those territories? Indeed, slavery undermined the Whig cause in 1844. Clay, from Kentucky and a slave owner, was thought to be more moderate on slavery than Polk, also a slave owner. But he just couldn't convince anti-slavery Northerners that he wasn't going to be conciliatory on slavery. Behind the scenes, Fillmore hoped he could be nominated as Clay's vice presidential running mate. He seems to have thought this because, as Clay was a Southerner, the Whigs would have to put a Northerner in the VP spot to balance the ticket, and theoretically, Fillmore could deliver New York State, which the Whigs needed to win. This thinking wasn't necessarily wrong, but Fillmore himself wasn't the guy. The main drama of the Whigs' 1844 convention in Baltimore was the vice presidential nomination, as Clay was chosen as the main candidate without much of a fuss. Seward and Weed theoretically supported Fillmore as the VP nominee, but it was no secret that they really wanted that slot for Seward. He didn't get it either. Eventually, it went to Theodore Frelinghuysen of New Jersey. As a consolation prize, Weed agreed to support Fillmore as the Whig candidate for New York governor. Despite going into it with high hopes, the 1844 election turned out to be kind of a disappointment for the Whigs generally and Fillmore personally. Clay and Frelinghuysen didn't exactly set America on fire with their slogan, "Hooray, hooray, the country's risin', vote for Clay and Frelinghuysen." Polk, with his 1991 hockey player mullet and dreams of empire, was a much more exciting candidate and won a fairly solid majority in the Electoral College. But in reality, the election was pretty close. New York was indeed the key state. Clay lost it by 1% of the vote. Fillmore thought it was because the convention didn't nominate him for vice president. It wasn't. Fillmore himself got clowned in the New York governor's race, losing by 10,000 votes. He just wasn't that popular. No, what probably made the difference was a small party called the Liberty Party, which was staunchly anti-slavery. They had nominated James Birney, a former slave owner who turned against the institution, and who was also, ironically, a Freemason. According to official records, only 5,106 votes separated Polk and Clay from each other in New York. The Liberty Party won 15,814 votes. So, if even only a third of the people who voted Liberty had instead voted for Clay, he would have become president. Why, as some historians have wondered, did those people not vote strategically for Clay, the ostensibly less slavery-y of the two major candidates, both of them slave owners? When I put the question like that to you, you can probably guess the answer. This, incidentally, is Ashland, Henry Clay's plantation house in Kentucky. It was built by slaves. If anti-slavery was your guiding issue in 1844, would you have voted for the guy who lived here? While I think this analysis is right, it's only part of the picture. The other part was anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant sentiment, and those pesky conspiracy theories that Fillmore believed in. In 1844, the Democrats heavily courted and largely won the Catholic and immigrant vote, especially in the big cities. Theodore Frelinghuysen, a devout Protestant, was a member of several Bible-thumping organizations that ferociously hated Catholics. Frelinghuysen himself was smart enough not to spout bigotry in public, but he didn't denounce this sentiment either. As a result, Catholics and immigrants greatly feared the Whig Party, which had elements in it, like Millard Fillmore, who were hostile to their very existence. The Catholic and immigrant vote helped pad the columns for Polk and denied Clay and the Whigs the victory they thought they should have won. Fillmore was right that the Whigs biffed an election that was eminently winnable, but it had nothing to do with him. They biffed it because they failed to recognize that there were growing numbers of voters who were done compromising with slavery and slave owners, and because they were getting too comfy with the nativist elements, while at the same time not being nativist enough to satisfy the bigots. Had the Whigs turned sharply and explicitly anti-slavery in 1844, as William Seward had already done in New York State, and had they repudiated nativism and xenophobia, they might have won the election, and they could have survived as a major party. After 1844, Fillmore was aboard a sinking ship, but he didn't know it. He wanted to be captain of that ship, or at least its first officer. After the 1844 election, Millard Fillmore skulked back home to Buffalo to resume his law practice. He was both despondent and resentful about the outcome of the election. Shortly after it, he wrote to Henry Clay, and his letter is uniquely insightful into the grudges Fillmore held and who he blamed for the loss, both of the presidency for Clay and the New York governorship for himself. The letter reads, quote, "The abolitionists and foreign Catholics have defeated us in this state. I will not trust myself to speak of the vile hypocrisy of the leading abolitionists now. Doubtless many acted honestly but ignorantly in what they did. It is enough to say that all is gone, and I must confess that nothing has happened to shake my confidence in our ability to sustain a free government so much as this. A cloud of gloom hangs over the future. May God save the country, for it is evident the people will not." End quote. Whether you liked or hated what he wanted to do, you can't argue that Polk was one of the most successful presidents ever in terms of carrying out what he promised and intended, even more so considering that he only served one term. Texas was finally annexed to the United States at the end of 1845. As his detractors promised, within 6 months, the U.S. was at war with Mexico. I'm not really going to go into detail on the Mexican-American War. There's some stuff on it in my Franklin Pierce video. Suffice it to say, the U.S. tore huge chunks of territory off of Mexico, as Polk intended, and the big military hero of the war was General Zachary Taylor. Remember that, it becomes important later. This is the campus of the University of Buffalo. Fillmore was instrumental in the founding of this institution, which was a long-standing goal of state leaders. The college was established mainly as a medical school to provide doctors for New York communities that were booming as a result of commerce facilitated by the Erie Canal. By coincidence, the university's charter was signed on May 11th, 1846, which was the exact same day President Polk sent his message to Congress asking them to declare war on Mexico, which they did. Fillmore remained chancellor of the University of Buffalo until the end of his life, but he continued to be a major political boss in the state. While the war was going on, in the fall of 1846, Fillmore achieved some kind of victory against his enemies, Seward and Weed, in New York by getting Fillmore's hand-picked candidate, John Young, no, not the astronaut, elected governor of New York. Fillmore himself was nominated as state comptroller and won by a huge margin. Now that sounds like a very minor office, but it was actually hugely important in New York. Basically, the comptroller is kind of like the chief financial officer of the state. Now moving into politics full-time, Fillmore closed up his law office, rented out his house, and moved to Albany, the state capital, at the beginning of 1848. This was about the time the Mexican War, which he opposed, was coming to an end. On February 2nd, 1848, Nicholas Trist, the American negotiator, signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo with the Mexican government, reeling from the defeat and occupation of their capital by Taylor's army. The treaty provided that a bunch of territory would go to the U.S., for which the American government would pay $15 million. The Senate ratified the treaty on March 10, 1848. Now the U.S. had a huge problem. All this vast territory seized from Mexico. Would it become free states or slave states? In August 1846, as the war was ramping up, an enterprising young congressman from Pennsylvania, David Wilmot, proposed an amendment to a funding bill that would have short-circuited this whole issue by declaring that slavery would not exist in any territory acquired from Mexico. The Wilmot Proviso, as it was called, was even more than a bombshell. It was like a string of firecrackers because it kept exploding in the faces of politicians repeatedly for the next 4 years. It was passed by the House originally, but the funding bill was killed. Nevertheless, Northern anti-slavery politicians, most of them Whigs, kept trying to bring the Wilmot Proviso back from the dead, trying to attach it to all sorts of things, but it could never pass the Senate because of the preponderance of pro-slavery Southerners there. An attempt was made to stick the Wilmot Proviso onto the treaty when it passed the Senate in early 1848. That failed too, but it was clear that the issue the Proviso was trying to solve, slavery in the newly acquired territories, would be the big issue in the upcoming presidential election, and indeed the biggest issue America would face in the late 1840s and early 50s. Soon enough, the Whigs were facing that election. Polk had pledged to serve only one term, so he was out. Among the Whigs, the usual suspects were convinced, once again, that 48 was their year. Henry Clay, now a two-time loser, thought the third time would be the charm for him. And Daniel Webster, always a bridesmaid but never a bride, also thought he had his name on the big chair. Both were pretty much delusional, as they were both yesterday's news, and they couldn't really generate the tingles even in Whig voters that they used to, much less anyone else. But these politicians, especially Clay, still had strong control over party machinery in various states, if not New York. So even though they were sort of zombie candidates, they were still technically in the mix. Who else was going to run? Whigs had some interest in John McLean, L-E-A-N, not McLean of Die Hard fame, who was a Supreme Court justice, but he was too anti-slavery to appeal to the South. But the real question among Whigs was whether they could get Zachary Taylor, the war hero, to run on their platform. Taylor wasn't a Whig and in fact had never voted before, but he was thought to be sympathetic to their issues. After the disaster of 1844, you can understand why Taylor was attractive. The one and only time the Whigs had won the presidency before, in 1840, was with a war hero who had been born in the South. Taylor was born in Virginia, as Harrison had been, and he owned slaves, which made him safe to run in the southern states. In fact, Southern Whigs, almost all of them pro-slavery, were instrumental in the early Taylor for President clubs. A prominent organizer of one of them was Alexander Stephens, future vice president of the Confederacy in the Civil War. Interestingly, another member of this same club was none other than Abraham Lincoln, former one-term congressman and passionate Whig, despite the fact that he was also passionately anti-slavery. This kind of thing gave Whig political leaders the idea that Taylor was popular enough to bridge the widening gap in the country between pro- and anti-slavery voters. In early June 1848, thousands of Whig politicians flooded into Philadelphia for the occasion of the Whig National Presidential Convention. It was held at a place called the Chinese Museum, an extremely odd venue for a political convention. It doesn't exist anymore, having been burned down in 1854, so the best the wormhole can show us is where it used to be, on this corner, only a few blocks from Independence Hall. Clay and Taylor each had significant groups of supporters who went into the Chinese Museum thinking they had the better chance. Besides Webster and John McLean, the also-rans included Winfield Scott, a general and war hero, and John Clayton, senator from Delaware. There were 279 delegates up for grabs. You needed 140 to win. On the first ballot, Taylor led with 111, Clay at 97, Scott 43, Webster 22, Clayton 4, and McLean 2. Clay's supporters were shocked that he didn't do better. Many of the bosses at the convention hoped to start a stampede of support for Scott as the only alternative to Taylor. Scott, after all, was also a military hero, but he was from the North and thought of as anti-slavery. Thurlow Weed, who was at the convention, hated Clay but distrusted Scott. By the second day of the convention, he had swung his New York people in favor of Taylor. There were rumors, unconfirmed and probably untrue, that he did this because he got some kind of tacit deal from Taylor's people, that if Taylor won, he would appoint William Seward as Secretary of State. Weed was always trying to get favors for Seward, usually at the expense of Millard Fillmore. For the record, Fillmore was not at the convention. 3 more ballots were taken. On the second and third, Taylor slowly gained support while Clay faded. Most of Taylor's support came from southern slave states. Clay, as a slave owner, couldn't appeal to enough northern anti-slavery Whigs to get over the top or even to sustain what he had. By the final ballot, many Whig delegates were near despair. The only hope for party unity was to nominate and hopefully elect a slave-owning Southerner. Taylor got over the top on the 4th ballot with 171 votes. With president decided, the battle now turned to the vice presidential spot, and this was where history finally tapped Millard Fillmore on the shoulder. Because the convention had nominated a Southern slaveholder, the VP spot would have to go to a Northerner to have any hope of appealing to a national electorate. New York, as the state with the most electoral votes, was probably going to field the strongest nominee. Because so much was riding on New York, this projected the New York State political soap opera, Thurlow Weed and William Seward and his supporters on one side versus Millard Fillmore and his supporters on the other, onto a national stage. Eventually, Weed's plan was to withdraw Seward from official contention as vice president and instead get Northern delegates to support Abbott Lawrence, a former representative from Massachusetts. Fillmore's supporters, naturally, were eager to thwart any plans of Weed's because they wanted their man, Fillmore, to become the top dispenser of political patronage in New York. So they started flapping their gums at the convention about how Lawrence would alienate too many Northerners, and how the delegates should vote for Fillmore, who hadn't said much publicly about slavery, pro or con. It was probably Fillmore's well-known anti-Catholic sentiment, born out of his belief in conspiracy theories that Catholics were planning to destroy the U.S., that got Fillmore the nomination. Because, as we've seen, another factor in New York politics was nativism, or hatred of immigrants and Catholics. Fillmore could deliver those people's votes. Seward couldn't, and Abbott Lawrence certainly couldn't. That Fillmore was barely known outside of New York State didn't matter much. On June 9, 1848, the Whig convention took 2 ballots to nominate a vice presidential candidate. Fillmore was in the lead on both, but the second one got him over the top with 173 votes to Lawrence's 87. Millard Fillmore had never met Zachary Taylor, but now they were united together on the Whig presidential ticket in 1848. Fillmore didn't campaign. He gave no speeches or interviews. Vice presidential candidates in the 19th century generally didn't do those things. He could sit home and play with paper clips for a couple of months and wait for the telegram to come in notifying him that he'd been elected vice president. Democrats weren't doing well in 1848. They nominated Lewis Cass, senator from Michigan. The real drama of the Democrats' convention involved Martin Van Buren, former president. He wanted another shot, but being staunchly anti-slavery, he got hot and bothered when New York's delegation was officially split between groups of pro-slavery and anti-slavery delegates. He also apparently really hated Cass. Martin Van Buren stalked out of the convention in a huff. Throughout 1847 and 1848, a series of small anti-slavery parties in the North held nominating conventions for various candidates for president. But after the drama at the Democratic Convention, these parties started to fuse into a de facto coalition, which has generally been known as the Free Soil Party. In August 1848, a Free Soil Convention officially nominated Van Buren for president. On Election Day, 1848, Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore pulled out 47.3% of the popular vote to Cass's 42.5% and just over 10% for Van Buren's Free Soil. Taylor had 163 electoral votes to Cass's 127. Although Van Buren didn't win a single electoral vote, he did have a significant impact on the election. He won 26.43% of the vote in New York, just ahead of 25.07% for Cass. The split enabled Taylor to win the state, even though he polled less than 50% of the vote there, and would have lost fairly decisively if the anti-Whig votes had been concentrated behind one candidate. So now you know how Millard Fillmore became vice president. It turned out to be quite a fateful decision and may well have hastened the Civil War. On March 5th, 1849, which turned out to be a snowy day in Washington, Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore were sworn into office as the new president and vice president. The inauguration was not held on March 4th, the traditional day, because that was a Sunday. I guess God doesn't want presidents to be inaugurated on Sundays? I don't know, makes no sense, but whatever. The new administration faced 3 main issues. One was whether California should be admitted to the Union as a state. Part of the plunder taken from Mexico in the war, California's population swelled quickly after the discovery of gold there in 1848, and pretty soon it qualified for statehood. The second issue was the status of slavery in the other new territories, the Wilmot Proviso question. And third was troublesome Texas's demands for more territory at the expense of New Mexico. The Whigs were pretty disorganized in the first year of the administration. The way things worked at this time, there was a long gap, more than a year, between elections and when members of Congress who were elected actually took their seats. The 1848 elections had left the House of Representatives a mess. Remember the Free Soil Party? Largely because of that split in New York State, the Free Soil Party had a run of success and managed to elect 9 members of the House. What this meant is that neither of the two major parties, the Whigs and Democrats, had a majority. After a contentious election for Speaker of the House, that's going to come up again, by the way, Congress finally sat down to business just before Christmas, 1849. One of the members of that Congress was Henry Clay, who, after several years out of power, was re-elected to the Senate by the Kentucky State Legislature in early 1849. Now in his 70s, Clay decided, both for his legacy and to try to foster unity in the Whig Party and the country, to design a grand compromise that he hoped would solve all the major issues relating to slavery. This was the genesis of the infamous Compromise of 1850. I could do a 3-hour video on this alone, so understand that my treatment of it here is necessarily a simplification. Introduced by Henry Clay at the end of January 1850, here were the major pieces, scattered across 8 bills that Clay intended to be linked. 1. California comes in as a free state. California Territory had already voted on a proposed constitution without slavery. 2. The Texas-New Mexico boundary dispute will be settled, mostly in favor of New Mexico. Texas doesn't get all or even much of what it claims. 3. Public slave auctions will be banned in the District of Columbia. This had been a sore spot for Northern abolitionists, embarrassed by the spectacle of selling live human beings within sight of the nation's monuments. 4, sort of the flip side of 3, Congress will pass a law saying it can never abolish slavery in the District of Columbia unless the people of D.C. and Maryland agree. 5, the United States will assume debts run up by the so-called Republic of Texas before it became part of the U.S. 6, remaining new territories such as Utah and New Mexico will be organized without any restrictions on slavery. 7, Congress will pass a law stating it will never interfere with the interstate slave trade. And 8, a very powerful fugitive slave law would be enacted, making sure that runaway enslaved people could be recaptured in the North and sent back into slavery. President Taylor, in his first message to Congress the previous month, December 1849, had a different set of proposals. He wanted admission of California as a free state. On that he agreed with Clay, but also thought New Mexico should come in, meaning a repudiation of Texas's claims. He did not want a fugitive slave law or to tamper with slavery in D.C., stating, in fact, that Congress should, quote, abstain from the introduction of those exciting topics of a sectional character which have hitherto produced painful apprehensions in the public mind. End quote. In other words, Congress should stop trying to deal with slavery directly. Soon, political camps crystallized around and against either Clay's proposals, usually called the Omnibus Bill, and Taylor's. Keep in mind that Taylor was ostensibly a Whig, and Henry Clay was a Whig. A major leader in Congress was going against the president of his own party on the most important issues in front of the country at that time. Clay, soon joined by Webster, basically thought Taylor was an upstart, small potatoes, and even though neither of them had been elected president, they should still call the shots. It's been a relatively common thing, though certainly not universal, for American historians to praise the Compromise of 1850 as a grand, wise, far-sighted deal made by the great statesman that saved the Union and postponed the Civil War for another 10 years. I think this interpretation is utter nonsense. If you look at the provisions carefully, It's plain that the Compromise of 1850 was a virtually total sellout to the South. Look at what anti-slavery Northerners got. California as a free state. Big whoop. There were virtually no slaves in California in 1850, and even pro-slavery Southerners admitted the climate wasn't good for cotton plantations, though some of them did have twisted dreams of forcing slaves to work in gold mines. Just think about how horrible that would have been. Number 2, dissing Texas territorial claims, also big whoop. One of the major reasons Texas made those claims in the first place was to suck up more territory for slavery. And number 6, organization of new territories without the Wilmot Proviso meant those new territories could become slave states. So who cares whether they were part of Texas or some other new slave state? Number 3 is also a cheat. It would ban the public sale of slaves in D.C. The private sale of human beings would continue to be perfectly legal. And all the rest of these so-called compromise proposals were clearly just gimmies to the pro-slavery South. Clay's grand compromise was basically just a surrender to the increasing political power of slavery in the United States. No wonder it was so controversial in the North. And don't talk to me about Daniel Webster being a great compromiser and a wise statesman. On March 7th, 1850, as the bills were being debated, he gave a speech urging the passage of the Omnibus Bill as a means to save the Union. But in doing so, he completely torched his previous multi-decade career and his credibility as a Whig by going back on his long-standing opposition to extending slavery into new territories. Furthermore, the proposals of the new Fugitive Slave Act, which I'll talk about more in detail in the next chapter, would pinch his own state, Massachusetts, particularly hard. The provisions of the Fugitive Slave Act fell disproportionately on communities of free African Americans, of which Boston had some of the largest at the time. Immediately after he gave this speech, Webster's name was mud in Massachusetts, probably the most abolitionist state in the Union. Fast forward to July 4th, 1850. This is where you came in. Big celebration at the Washington Monument. Cherries, cold milk, Taylor starts barfing and pooping. 5 days later, he's dead. And Millard Fillmore is now the 13th President of the United States. This changed everything. By July, Clay's omnibus bill was virtually dead in Congress. It was clear that Taylor would have vetoed it anyway, so what was the point? Clay himself even threw in the towel, took a leave of absence, and went back to Kentucky. At this point, though, with Fillmore in office, and after he made it known that he told Taylor before he died that he, Fillmore, would have signed the compromise into law if he could, another senator started to rescue the omnibus bill from the junk heap. This was Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas. His innovation was to break the compromise into pieces, 5 in all, and then lobby different coalitions of congressmen and senators to back individual parts of it. The votes started coming in during August. Fillmore offered what little clout he had as the new president to persuade Northerners in the House to support the pieces of the compromise. Some of the votes were squeakers, but the pieces of Clay's former omnibus bill passed. Between September 9th and September 18th, 1850, President Fillmore signed the 5 bills that ultimately became the compromise. Fillmore signed this monstrous thing into law. He bears a significant part of the blame, and the foul stink of the Compromise of 1850 is the major part of his historical reputation. You may think I'm exaggerating. I'm not. When you finally delve into the Fugitive Slave Act, you might be amazed just how awful it was. And enforcing it was the major project of Fillmore's presidency. That's in the next chapter. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 has every right to be called the worst piece of legislation ever passed by the U.S. Congress. Others you might be able to think of: the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, the Alien and Sedition Acts, Daylight Savings Time, pale in comparison to this one. You're not even going to believe how bad this thing was. And, as we'll see in a few minutes, Millard Fillmore absolutely loved it. There had previously been a Fugitive Slave Act in the United States, passed in 1793. It made it fairly easy for Southern slave owners to use the courts, even in northern states where slavery was banned, to recapture formerly enslaved African Americans who had been lucky enough to escape. Northerners hated this law, and several northern states passed what were called personal liberty laws that tried to unstack the deck that was clearly stacked in favor of Southerners and slavery. Pro-slavery politicians were outraged and never stopped grumbling about these laws. That was the whole idea behind a new Fugitive Slave Act, to make the 1793 Act even worse. The major thing was that it established a board of federally appointed commissioners who would operate in every state, especially to hear cases brought by slave owners involving runaway slaves. And in these cases, the act prohibited the testimony of the enslaved person themselves from ever being admitted into evidence. Furthermore, the law said that any person who interfered with the recapture of runaway slaves would be fined $1,000 and do 6 months in jail, and also be liable for $1,000 per slave, paid to the owner of the slave if the person was not recaptured. $1,000 in 1850 was the equivalent of about $39,400 in today's money, and the law provided the same fine for any law officer who failed to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. How could failure to enforce even be defined? Never said. So imagine this scenario. Say you live in Philadelphia, in a state where slavery was illegal, and there were large communities of free African Americans. You're walking down the street, and an African American man whom you've never seen before comes up to you and says, "Hi, can you tell me where Chestnut Street is?" You point him in the right direction and go on your way. It just so happens that the person you gave directions to was a former slave from Virginia who was on his way to a safe house on Chestnut Street. You didn't know any of this. A police officer happens to witness you speaking to this man. A few days later, a professional slave catcher hired by some plantation owner in Virginia appears in a court in Philadelphia, claiming that they represent the owner of the former slave. The court sentences you to 6 months in prison and a fine of the equivalent of $39,000 for having given directions to the man whom you had never seen before. Not only would this be perfectly legal, but the police officer and the commissioner would be compelled to prosecute you, because they would also be fined the equivalent of $39,000 for letting you get away. It could be even worse than that. Change the scenario slightly. So the African American you spoke to was not, in fact, a former slave at all, but a man who had been born free in Philadelphia. A professional slave catcher could forge a document stating that he was the property of the Virginia plantation owner. When presented in court, the claim of ownership could never be challenged, because the man's testimony that he was born free in Philadelphia would be barred from the proceeding, and no one in Philadelphia would be in a position to know that the owner's purported claim was fake. And the slave catcher would have an incentive to forge the document, and the commissioner an incentive to rule in his favor, because the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 also provided that every commissioner who ruled in favor of a slave owner would get a $10 bonus, but only a $5 fee if he ruled in favor of the alleged slave. So the law essentially allowed free people in the North who had never been slaves to be captured and sent into slavery, with money paid to the officials who allowed it, and heavy fines and jail time for anyone who tried to interfere with the process. I told you it was bad. Millard Fillmore thought this law was just peachy. In the early days of his presidency, while the compromise was still working its way through Congress, he was adamant that it be passed. When it did pass, he asked his Attorney General, John Crittenden, a slave owner, if it was constitutional. He said, "Yeah, sure." Fillmore signed it the day after that opinion came down. It was the worst decision of his presidency and his life. Some historians, Robert Rayback, I'm looking at you, have tried to claim that Fillmore was reluctant about the Fugitive Slave Act, that he tried to delay signing it, or that he had fits of conscience about it. The evidence indicates exactly the opposite, that he was happy about it and believed it to be a key part of the Compromise of 1850 that would never have gone into effect if not for him, and which he and many others believed was the final settlement of the slavery issue in the United States. Some people, like William Seward in New York, suggested that at the very least, the law should be modified with provisions to protect free African Americans from getting captured and enslaved. Fillmore refused even this. He maintained that the law should not be tampered with in the slightest. It's the final settlement of slavery. Done. End of story. No modifications. Fillmore aggressively enforced the Fugitive Slave Act. For example, he authorized the United States Marines to help slave catchers recapture supposed fugitive slaves in Philadelphia, and even sent federal troops to Boston to prevent anti-slavery mobs from trying to free people detained by federal authorities on suspicion of being runaway slaves. In Boston, in September 1851, an African-American named Shadrach Minkins was arrested by a federal marshal on suspicion of being a runaway slave. Several prominent Boston lawyers came forward to represent him. One of them was Richard Henry Dana Jr., who incidentally wrote the classic Sea memoir 2 years before the mast. A group of African-Americans rushed into the courtroom, rescued Minkins, and helped him get to Canada. Fillmore was enraged. He ordered that somebody had to go to jail for having rescued Shadrach Minkins, and the government kept bringing charges against some of the lawyers and other prominent members of Boston's anti-slavery community in a series of show trials, all of which resulted in hung juries or acquittals. Another successful rescue of a fugitive slave occurred in Christiana, Pennsylvania in September 1851, the same month as the Minkins affair. A few weeks later, Fillmore decided to make an example out of these slave rescues by organizing the capture of a former enslaved man during a political convention of the anti-slavery Liberty Party in Syracuse, New York, very near Fillmore's own home turf of Buffalo. The former slave, whose name was William Henry but nicknamed Jerry, was arrested, but anti-slavery whites and African Americans stormed the police station and sprang him from custody. Like Minkins, Jerry was successfully transported to Canada. This time, President Fillmore really melted down. He wanted to make an example of the Jerry case. So, his administration brought indictments of 41 people, 5 white people, and 36 African Americans for treason. Not violation of the fugitive slave law. Treason, the only crime described in the Constitution, and which would potentially carry the death penalty. That was how much Millard Fillmore loved the fugitive slave law. He wanted 41 people executed for helping a former slave escape. Fillmore's administration failed miserably in these trials. Only one man was convicted of a minor offense, resisting a federal officer, and he died while the case was on appeal. The other cases were postponed indefinitely, charges dropped, acquitted, or hung juries. More than just blowing up in Fillmore's face and covering his historical legacy with stink, Fugitive Slave Act arguably, and I am making this argument, brought on the Civil War sooner than it would otherwise have occurred. Not later, sooner. It radicalized huge numbers of people in the North and brought them firmly into the anti-slavery camp, because basically the law required them to participate in the enforcement of slavery in parts of the country where slavery was banned. Previously, it was mostly abolitionists and those who were sympathetic to them who considered slavery-related matters the most important political issues of the day. After 1850, though, many people were suddenly waking up and finding themselves abolitionists, whether expressly or implicitly. Harriet Beecher Stowe, yes, that's her, on the thumbnail of my Franklin Pierce video, wrote the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, which came out in 1852, largely as a response to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This novel, too, helped radicalize Northerners, if one can consider anti-slavery to be a radical position. Fillmore's ham-fisted presidency, which was wrecked in large measure by these overzealous prosecutions related to the Fugitive Slave Act, also largely put a stake through the heart of the Whig Party itself in 1852. The political realignment that occurred in the 1850s, with both major parties breaking up and reconsolidating around pro- and anti-slavery lines, definitely hastened the Civil War. Nice job, Millard. Way to go. The issues involving slavery and the Compromise of 1850, which was mainly about slavery, were undoubtedly the biggest and most prominent issues in Fillmore's presidency. But for the sake of fairness and completeness, it's worth talking about the non-slavery matters. There aren't a whole lot of them, and Fillmore's track record is arguably not that much better on them than on the slavery stuff. Having just given Fillmore at least part of the blame for the Civil War, I don't want to seem like I'm also blaming him for World War II. I'm not. That would be absurd, of course. But Fillmore does have a place in the distant history of the genesis of that conflict, specifically the part of it between the United States and Japan. This is because Fillmore was instrumental in sending the Perry expedition to quote-unquote open Japan, a process that wasn't complete until after his administration ended. In the 1830s and 40s, European powers were taking advantage of the weakness of China's rickety Qing dynasty government to secure lopsided and unfair trade deals, sometimes at gunpoint, as the British did with the Opium Wars. Americans were tempted by the idea of getting a trade concession of their own in the Far East, especially if other European powers could be shut out. Japan had been closed to almost all foreign trade since 1603. Leaders in Congress and Millard Fillmore were persuaded by various boosters, such as Ranald MacDonald, no, not the clown, that opening Japan to Western trade was worth trying. In addition to the economic benefits, Japan could theoretically cease to be a place where shipwrecked Western sailors feared for their lives to be washed up. Daniel Webster, Secretary of State, was instrumental in getting Fillmore to move on this possibility. So, what became the Perry expedition took shape. To make a very long story short, an American naval expedition under Commodore Matthew Perry, who was Webster's second choice for commander, set out for Japan in November 1852, not long before Fillmore's term ended. The warships sailed into Tokyo Bay and demanded the Japanese sign trade agreements under threat of force. The 250-year-old Tokugawa shogunate, which was highly xenophobic, couldn't withstand the shock, though it took more than 15 years for it to collapse. Japan's Meiji era, which began in 1868, sought to modernize the country rapidly, and Japan set itself on a course that would increasingly bring it into competition with the United States. That competition became open war between the two in 1941. As I said, it's not fair to blame Fillmore for that, but he is involved in the story of how that situation came to be. Another problem that Fillmore faced was what are called filibusters. Now, there's two meanings to that word, filibuster. I am not talking about the legislative tactic where a senator or congressman refuses to yield the floor and ends up reading out of the phone book for hours on end to prevent a bill from passing or being voted on. The other meaning of filibuster is a uniquely 19th century one. It's where a private citizen takes it upon himself to try to invade or conquer territory of another country, hoping that the government will ultimately back them up and legitimize their illegal actions. In the 1850s, various reckless adventurers tried this tactic, almost always with the goal of seizing more territory for the expansion of slavery. Some politicians expressly endorsed this, and for that reason. Senator Albert Gallatin Brown of Mississippi was one of them. In 1850, when Taylor was still alive, a man called Narciso Lopez sailed to Cuba, which was under Spanish rule, and took over a town there before the Spanish army drove him off. Lopez was brought back to the U.S., and several people who helped him were prosecuted. But when those trials ended in hung juries, Fillmore, now in office, backed off and dropped the prosecutions. This enabled Lopez to try again to invade Cuba, which he did in August 1851. This was actually his third attempt. Lopez and many of his men were captured and executed by the Spanish. One of them was William Crittenden, the nephew of Fillmore's Attorney General. 160 others were sent back to Spain as prisoners. Fillmore negotiated for their release despite his public statements that he disapproved of filibusters and that the U.S. government wouldn't protect them. Guess what? The U.S. government protected them, at least the ones that were still alive. The fact that the ultimate point of filibuster expeditions was to secure land for slavery probably was part of the appeal for Fillmore. Franklin Pierce, Fillmore's successor, would also have problems with filibusters. Fillmore has some minor presence in the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. The story of the Mormons and their odyssey into the West is a tale for another time. So too is that of Joseph Smith, founder of the religion, who ran for president in 1844 and was killed by an angry mob that year. In 1850, Utah was organized as a federal territory, a result of some of the Compromise of 1850 settlements. There were a number of LDS settlements already there, and Fillmore decided that they could be useful to expand American influence into the interior of the West. So, in February 1851, Fillmore appointed Brigham Young, one of Joseph Smith's successors, as governor of Utah Territory. Young got right to work, not only expanding LDS settlements in Utah, but also slaughtering Native Americans who lived there. Mormons had already been doing that even before Young's appointment as governor. Speaking of genocides, that kind of thing was also going on in California during Fillmore's administration. California may have ostensibly been a free state according to the Compromise of 1850, but even before official statehood, its legislature passed a law making it legal to enslave Native Americans. Peter Burnett, first governor of the state of California, expressly called for genocide against Native Americans in his inaugural address. Over the next several years, a series of state-sanctioned and often state-funded death squads massacred tens of thousands of indigenous people in California, especially in the Central Valley. Fillmore didn't lift a finger to stop this. He flushed significant federal resources down the toilet to prosecute people for helping fugitive slaves escape, and sent a naval expedition to Japan, which in 1852 might as well have been the moon. But stopping an explicit genocide within the borders of a U.S. state, apparently not his problem. In the interests of not being quite so relentlessly negative in this video, I tried to find something that I liked about the Fillmore administration. It took some digging, but Fillmore and his wife Abigail did establish, for the first time, a permanent White House library. And also, apparently at the behest of Abigail, Fillmore also officially abolished flogging as a punishment in the U.S. Navy. There, that's positive. In fact, if you're wondering about Abigail, she was a distinguished, well-liked, and apparently successful First Lady. She was one of the first U.S. president's wives to become any sort of public figure. Unfortunately, Abigail was in poor health for much of her husband's term. She suffered an injury to her ankle in 1851 and was sometimes unable to attend to social business, though to what degree the injury affected her isn't entirely clear. Sometimes she went back to Buffalo to rest and recuperate, or just to get out of the White House. Increasingly in the later months of the administration, the Fillmore's daughter, Mary Abigail, served as White House hostess. There are assertions that Abigail Fillmore warned her husband not to sign the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850. Alas, there is no evidence to substantiate this. Almost all papers to, from, or mentioning Abigail Fillmore in the couple's possession were destroyed by their son years later. That's it. That's all I got. White House library banning flogging, and his wife might have been okay, but we don't know for sure because there's no documentation. I'm sure somebody in the comments will chide me for presenting a one-sided view of Fillmore's administration. But honestly, if you can find something to get excited about here, you're welcome to try. I'm not hiding anything. My sources are plainly listed in the credits. Or you can just go watch cat videos instead. In any event, we're moving on. This chapter isn't going to focus on Fillmore himself very much, but the material in this chapter is very necessary for understanding the ultimate trajectory of Fillmore's political career, and how and why the two major political parties imploded and reorganized in the 1850s just prior to the Civil War. The term Know Nothing did not make its first appearance in print, so far as anyone can tell, until November 1853, after Fillmore left office, but the movement it describes was very much in existence long before that time. As we've already seen in this story, during the 1840s, nativism, which was marked most often by hostility to immigrants and especially Catholics, was rising as a political force in America. About 1850, believers in these ideas started to found secret societies to promote their ideology. They organized into lodges and chapters, the usual stock in trade of local grassroots organizations. Ironically, this structure reflected in many ways the Freemasons, which Know Nothings also hated. The term Know Nothing got started because the lodges told their members if anyone who wasn't a member asked about the organization, they were supposed to reply, "I know nothing about that." These were considered to be fraternal organizations, not traditional political parties. Why the secrecy? Well, it had to do with their belief in conspiracy theories. Yes, you guessed it, these guys bought into the conspiracy theory that the Pope was radio controlling all Catholic immigrants in America to do his bidding, which would inevitably mean the destruction of Protestantism and the fall of the Republic. Staying secret about their meetings and proceedings, and even who was in the club and who wasn't, was thought of as a defense against those evil Catholics and the politicians who were supposedly beholden to them. About 1852, two of these major know-nothing organizations in New York City, the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner and the Order of United Americans, merged. You couldn't just join a know-nothing party. You had to be nominated by an existing member and vetted by a committee at the lodge you wanted to join. To be eligible, you had to be 21, believe in God, be a native-born American citizen, a Protestant, your parents had to be Protestant, and you could not be married to a Catholic. A constitution of a know-nothing lodge from Connecticut in 1854 specifies that members must resist, quote, "the insidious policy of the Church of Rome and all other foreign influences against the institutions of our country by placing in all offices in the gift of the people, whether by election or appointment, none but native-born Protestant citizens," end quote. Because they were a network of loosely affiliated chapters or lodges, there was no monolithic ideology that the Know-Nothings espoused. But the most popular and widely held beliefs among them can generally be recognized. First, they absolutely believed in the basic conspiracy theory that Catholics were controlled by the Pope and bent on destroying Protestantism. Secondly, they believed that Catholicism was completely incompatible with democracy and American values. Because, in their view, Catholics all took orders from the Pope, they were incapable of allegiance to the United States. Third, they supported restrictions on immigrants achieving citizenship. In the mid-19th century, most states naturalized immigrants. It wasn't yet controlled by federal law, interestingly, after 5 years' residence in the country. The Know-Nothings usually wanted that period extended to 21 years, and some of them recommended immigration laws be changed to prevent people with criminal records back home or poor immigrants from becoming citizens. What's interesting and noteworthy was that Know-Nothings generally did not seek to stop immigration itself, meaning to cut off the influx of people coming into the U.S. from overseas. They only wanted immigrants to be basically excluded from civic and political life, at least until they'd been in America for 21 years. This is a major difference between the 19th century nativists and modern anti-immigrant political movements in the U.S. and Europe today, who almost always want to stop or limit immigration itself. Two other important aspects of the Know-Nothing worldview are worth mentioning, though I have to caveat this by saying that while prevalent, these views were by no means true of all of them. Many Know-Nothings were anti-slavery. Whether or not they favored the abolition of slavery on moral grounds, most of them believed strongly in limiting the spread of slavery to new territories. And many, but again not all, were prohibitionists. They wanted to ban alcohol. The temperance movement was surging in the mid-19th century, and hostility to booze was a major part of their program. Know-Nothing sentiments had been associated with violence. In Philadelphia, in the spring and summer of 1844, anti-Catholic conspiracy theorists rioted, targeting mostly Catholic churches and schools and killing at least 20 people. Indeed, the Philadelphia riots were a significant background issue in the 1844 presidential election, impressing upon both the Whig and Democratic parties how deep anti-Catholic sentiment ran in northern cities. Know-Nothings had their major political success in 1854, when they organized formally as the American Party, although there were forerunner organizations to that one that existed previously, like the American Republican Party that went back to 1843. It was, however, the collapse of the Whigs after the 1852 election that really energized the movement. As Fillmore himself has a lot to do with that story, let's turn to that next. Millard Fillmore certainly wanted to be elected to a term as president in his own right in 1852. The historical record isn't entirely clear, however, whether that was his intention from the beginning or whether he came to the decision later. Fillmore does seem to have told a friend of his in December 1851 that he wasn't going to run in 52. He may have done that, mainly to be able to say that his friend, air quotes, convinced him to run, as if he didn't really want it. Yet, as early as March 1851, newspapers were already endorsing him for president, and Fillmore didn't object. Tellingly, he was particularly popular in the South, probably for his hard-nosed enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. But guess who else thought he was running for the Whig nomination in 1852? Daniel Webster, who just had to have one more try at the big chair. Most people thought this was nuts. Webster was now past 70, in poor health, and had lost much of his political clout, especially in Massachusetts, by selling out so shamelessly to slavery during the Compromise of 1850 debates. Webster was also Fillmore's Secretary of State. So, you got that? A sitting president running for election in his own right was being challenged by his own Secretary of State for the nomination of their party as president. Why did Fillmore allow this? At the very least, he should have said, hey, Webster, if you want to run for president, go right ahead, but resign as Secretary of State first. He didn't do that. Before we conclude that Fillmore was a political moron, which I don't think is the case, I think we have to appreciate that the candidate he was truly afraid of wasn't Webster, but Fillmore's much more usual nemesis, William Seward. By keeping Webster in the race, he may have thought that Seward and Webster would split the anti-Fillmore vote among Whig Party regulars, which would hand Fillmore the nomination on a silver platter. If that was what he thought, he botched it badly. Another major candidate in the race was Winfield Scott, the old War of 1812 general who had come in second to Zachary Taylor at the previous Whig convention, 1848. By early 1852, Northern anti-slavery Whigs were starting to gravitate to him. That Scott had such cachet among the Whigs is a demonstration of just how out of ideas the party was. The party had only won the presidency twice, each time by nominating a popular war hero. The internal divisions of the party, especially the pro versus anti-slavery people and the anti-Catholic conspiracy theories, meant basically that only a candidate with a base of popularity independent of politics was likely to poll enough votes in both the North and the South to win. Really, the only kind of person in that category in the 1850s was a war hero. This is a site in Baltimore that used to be... Wait, what? Ancient Egypt? No, that's the next video. Next video. You're drunk, wormhole. Center Market, Baltimore. Come on. Okay, this is a site in Baltimore where a large exhibition hall called Center Market used to stand. It burnt down in 1904 and was replaced eventually by this children's museum. This is where the Whig National Convention was held in mid-June 1852. This was one of those nightmare political conventions with an endless series of ballots, which I am not going to go through in exhaustive detail. It was very hot in Baltimore during the convention, and the conditions in the hall must have been pretty miserable. The first couple of days were taken up by endless infighting over convention voting rules and party platform planks, which exposed deep divisions between Northern and Southern delegates. One of the planks was that the Whig Party declared that the Compromise of 1850 had ended the issue of slavery in American politics for all time. Yeah, right. A presidential candidate needed 149 votes to win. On the first ballot, President Fillmore and Winfield Scott finished in a virtual tie with 131 votes for Scott and 133 for Fillmore, and Webster got 29. 3 ballots were blank. Note this total. If Webster hadn't been in the race, and even a little more than half of his delegates voted for either Scott or Fillmore, that would have ended it right there. Either one of them could have gotten over the top. But Webster didn't withdraw, and Fillmore, who, again I remind you, was Webster's boss, didn't pressure him to. Instead, the convention kept taking ballots. Not much changed. On the 21st ballot, Scott had picked up a total of 2 votes to get 133, with Fillmore at 131 and Webster at 28. It went on and on. Some of the party men tried to make deals to end it, but either Fillmore's people or Webster's shot down every idea. The convention broke over Sunday and reconvened the following morning. At last, a block of Southern delegates started to defect to Scott. They feared that the division of the convention would help elect the Democratic candidate, Franklin Pierce. On the 52nd ballot, Scott got within 1 vote of the nomination. Fillmore's support had steadily been fading. On the 53rd, finally, Scott got over the top with 159 votes, 112 for Fillmore, and 21 stubbornly holding out for Daniel Webster. Despite Fillmore's fear of him, William Seward never got a single vote for the nomination. He supported Scott. It's extremely rare in American history for an incumbent president to be denied the nomination of his own party when he tried seriously to get it. Fillmore managed to pull that off despite the great weight of historical precedent. His case is even more remarkable because he was essentially done in by his own Secretary of State, who probably had no serious chance of becoming president. And even if he had been the nominee, would have died even before the election. Webster was in poor health at this time. He croaked in October 1852. For their part, the Democrats were doing only marginally better in 1852. For this, I direct you to my Franklin Pierce video, which explains how he got the nomination as a dark horse. However, Pierce had the advantage of being unanimously nominated at the end. The Whigs couldn't come together behind their candidate even when Scott won. They were hopelessly divided going into the fall election. Though there wasn't a whole lot of enthusiasm in the country for Franklin Pierce, whom nobody knew much about, he blew Scott away in the Electoral College with 254 votes to 42. It wasn't just about the White House. The Whigs collapsed at the polls in most other respects, too. They lost 14 seats in the House of Representatives and 4 in the Senate. They also lost several governorships. Some prominent Whigs predicted the imminent end of their party. And why not? By November 1852, both Henry Clay and Daniel Webster were dead, and Millard Fillmore largely humiliated. The convention and the election proved that the divide over slavery was now pretty much impossible to paper over. Millard Fillmore's last months in office were largely uneventful. Definitely not a candidate, he took no significant role in the 1852 presidential campaign. In February, he and Abigail started to ship their belongings back home to Buffalo and prepared to retire to private life. Then a cruel irony intervened. On Inauguration Day, March 4th, 1853, the Fillmores, Millard and Abigail, hosted the incoming president and his wife at the White House. They also attended Pierce's inauguration, which was gloomy because Pierce and his wife were mourning the hideous death of their 11-year-old son in a train accident about 8 weeks before. Abigail Fillmore caught a slight sniffle at the inauguration. When her condition became worse, the couple postponed their travel home to Buffalo and stayed instead at the Willard Hotel, where Fillmore had lived during the vice presidency. On March 30th, 1853, Abigail Fillmore died, having never made it back home after the end of her husband's presidency. He was devastated. Not being a self-made man or from a wealthy family, he returned home to Buffalo, his future prospects pretty bleak. As it turned out, he would have another chance in politics by embracing his inner conspiracy theorist. 1854 was a chaotic and disastrous year in American politics. The Whig Party, as we've seen, was already in the process of its final disintegration. But that year, the Democratic Party, which had won big in the previous elections, also began to break apart. Why? Well, slavery, of course. You know, the issue that the Whigs declared was over and done with. 2 Democratic politicians, I think, are particularly responsible for the chaos. Stephen Douglas, senator from Illinois, and Franklin Pierce, Fillmore's successor as president. I get into more detail on this in my Franklin Pierce video, so I'm not going to rehash it all here. Suffice it to say, the main culprit was a terrible law, almost as bad as the Fugitive Slave Act, called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This moldering turd was the brainchild of Douglas, who thought he'd dreamed up an idea that would both unite the splintering Democratic Party and solve the issue of slavery in new territories once and for all in one package. Douglas was a champion of the idea of popular sovereignty. This was the notion that the people of a territory, when it came time for statehood, should decide whether or not slavery would be legal in that territory or not, and that Congress should be hands-off. This policy, which the Kansas-Nebraska Act ultimately enshrined into law, led to literal war in Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers both tried to load up the territory with people who would vote their way. Fights broke out between pro- and anti-slavery communities. John Brown, who you may have heard of, was involved in this. In the decade between 1844 and 1854, when both the Whigs and Democrats found it increasingly difficult to bridge the divides between their respective pro-slavery and anti-slavery wings, and similarly between their northern and southern wings, which tracked mostly but not entirely on the slavery divide, two other broad political movements had proven capable of altering political results on a national level. In 1848, it was the Free Soil Party, an expressly anti-slavery party, which was in actuality more like a coalition of smaller fringe parties that could agree on the fact that they all hated slavery. In 1854, it was the Know-Nothings, who by now had also formed a coalition of their like-minded groups, the American Party. With the Whigs going down, the opportunity existed theoretically, for one of these two minority political groups to sit down in the chair opposite the Democrats and become the next major participant in the two-party system. In 1854, a new party suddenly appeared. This was, of course, the brand new Republican Party, whose core principle was to oppose the extension of slavery into any territory where it didn't already exist, meaning opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But the American Party, with its mostly urban-based nativist sentiment and its hatred of Catholics and immigrants, was also there. And as you recall, most of them, though not all, were anti-slavery, essentially the same platform as the Republicans, at least on that issue. Early Republican leaders saw their new party as a fusion of former Free Soil people and anti-slavery Whigs. They also hoped to attract disaffected Democrats, not very many left by 1854, who were frustrated with how often their party was bending over and spreading their cheeks for pro-slavery Southerners. The Know-Nothings, on the other hand, were prepared to capitalize on former Whigs who just couldn't let go of the anti-Catholic conspiracy stuff. The 1854 elections were disastrous for both the Democratic and what was left of the Whig parties. Democrats, unpopular mainly because of Franklin Pierce's bungling, hemorrhaged 75 seats in the House of Representatives, 3 in the Senate. Whigs biffed 14 seats in the House and 4 in the Senate. Most, though not all, of this inured to the benefit of the American Party, the Know-Nothings, who won 54 seats in the House of Representatives and also picked up a couple of state houses. Some other parties, including Republicans, had a good night, but the Know-Nothings were clearly the big winners. However, the seed of the Know-Nothings' decline was already set soon after. In June 1855, various Know-Nothing groups held a national convention in Philadelphia. Southern Know-Nothings insisted that the convention adopt a plank reading, quote, "The National Council has deemed it the best guarantee of common justice and future peace to abide by and maintain the existing laws upon the subject of slavery as a final and conclusive settlement of that subject in spirit and in substance," end quote. This was known as Section 12. The national Know-Nothing leadership knew this would alienate anti-slavery Northerners, but they thought it was essential to make the party competitive in the South, which it would have to be if they were going to compete seriously in the 1856 presidential election. Now, to be sure, Millard Fillmore was not a part of any of this. He didn't run for office in 1854 and did not attend American Party gatherings. Already in mourning for his wife, in July 1854, his daughter, Mary Abigail, aged 22, died of cholera. Of the members of his close family, only his son was still left alive. The key event that led to Fillmore's brief revival in politics came about as a result of the Know-Nothing's spectacular success in the House of Representatives elections. Because the American Party had chipped away at the Democrats' majority and also took advantage of the ongoing Whig collapse, the House, after 1854, did not have a single party with a majority of seats. The 34th Congress, elected in the fall of 1854, met for the first time in December 1855. Because no party had a majority, the election for Speaker of the House was a complete free-for-all. Democrats had the largest single block, 82 seats, with Know-Nothings and Whigs virtually tied at 52 to 54, and a scattering of other parties all hostile to the Democrats. Given the political dynamics, it was inevitable that the Know-Nothings would flex their muscle as the swing bloc within Congress. Their group, however, was extremely shaky. In fact, in the year between the 1854 elections and the time the winners of those elections showed up to take office in Congress, several Know-Nothing members had already become Republicans. After a speaker election that stretched over 2 months and an incredible 133 ballots, Nathaniel P. Banks of Massachusetts, a Know-Nothing, was finally elected Speaker of the House. But they had to change the rules to do it so that the Speaker could be elected by a plurality of votes, not a majority. One of the few times in American history that's ever happened. The result was seen politically as a good sign for Republicans. Banks, the winner, would very shortly become a Republican. It was this sloppy and frankly embarrassing episode that convinced Know-Nothing leaders that for their upcoming chance to run a presidential candidate, their first serious shot at the prize, they had to avoid fractious intra-party disputes and nominate someone that could not only unite Know-Nothings behind the American Party ticket, but might also have some appeal to voters in general. Who could they find who had national name recognition, who had some experience with political organizing, was from a state with a lot of electoral votes, who could appeal, if not to anti-slavery voters, perhaps to Democrats who were disaffected by Pierce and his disastrous performance as president, and who, among politicians who had these qualifications, also believed in nutty anti-Catholic conspiracy theories that was the party's whole reason for being? Did such a Superman exist? Millard Fillmore did not actively campaign for the American Party nomination. In fact, he was overseas. He left in March 1855, touring the UK, Ireland, France, Germany, Italy, Turkey, and Egypt. At one point he met Queen Victoria, who thought him to be very handsome. But the strangest part of Fillmore's journey was when he was brought to meet the Pope, Pius IX. Just to underscore how awkward this was, it would be like a 9/11 truther meeting George W. Bush. Back home, however, some Know-Nothing politicians strongly supported him for president. The American Party, despite its huge victory in 1854, was already starting to come apart. Remember Section 12, the Leave Slavery Alone plank in the party's platform? By early 1856, that was deeply dividing Northern from Southern Know-Nothings. To make matters worse, defections to the Republicans were increasing. The American Party held its nominating convention in Philadelphia in February 1856. Fillmore was still out of the country. The convention watered down the toxic Section 12, rendering it basically meaningless, neither pro-slavery nor anti. Fillmore won the American Party's nomination for president 179 votes to 64. Some delegates voted for him on the rationale that only somebody like him, with a strong independence from anti-slavery politics, could prevent their party from being absorbed by the Republicans. Andrew Jackson Donaldson, nephew of the Andrew Jackson, was put up for VP. Southern members of the American Party hailed Fillmore's nomination, but Northern members were disgusted. This was, after all, the man who brought treason prosecutions against people who had helped rescue runaway slaves. His nomination didn't stop defections to the Republicans. In fact, it accelerated them. The party leaders, inexperienced and a bit hasty, totally misread the room. So did Millard Fillmore. He was still in Europe and was notified of his nomination by letter. At first, he decided to delay on accepting it formally, but once in Paris, stranded by bad weather that prevented his proposed trip to Russia, he wrote a letter thanking the convention and accepting the nomination. He seems to have thought that the Whig Party could somehow be put back together with the Know-Nothings as its base. In the spring of 1856, that was just lunacy. The Republicans were on their first contest for the White House. They nominated John C. Fremont of California, a famous military officer and explorer of the far west, who had big-time name recognition across the country, and who had emerged as a staunch opponent of the spread of slavery. He probably wasn't going to win, but it was truly a novel strategy. Run a candidate with exclusively Northern appeal on an expressly anti-slavery platform and force voters to choose, once and for all, between pro- and anti-slavery candidates. Democrats nominated James Buchanan, a longtime politico from Pennsylvania, and probably the most craven, cutthroat, and cold-blooded politician in America at that time. Buchanan had been scheming to be president for most of the past 30 years, and had had several near misses, including in 1844. 12 years later, his time had come, and he captured the nomination, pushing aside Stephen Douglas of Illinois. Fremont and Republicans could neutralize Fillmore by using the same argument they leveled against Buchanan, that he was a doughface, a Northerner who had essentially pro-Southern views and would happily bend over and take it for slavery whenever asked to. The Know-Nothings fired back with basically the only charge they knew how to make. They claimed Fremont was a secret Catholic. His family was of French ancestry after all, and it seemed plausible. For the record, Fremont was not Catholic, though he was of illegitimate birth, another charge bandied about in the papers. Most third-party candidates in American history know they can't win, but soldier on hoping that they can prevent one of the two majors from getting an electoral majority, thus throwing the election into the House of Representatives. This was actually more plausible in 1856 than it's been at other times. If Fillmore carried a couple of states and prevented Buchanan or Fremont from winning outright, the dream was Republicans or Democrats might elect Fillmore in the House rather than letting the other party into the White House. But these political strategies are never well thought out, and they weren't in this case either. In any event, Buchanan did win an outright majority, 174 electoral votes. You needed 149 to win, and Fremont picked up 114 votes from 11 states, all of them in the North. Fillmore won only a single state, Maryland, and 8 electoral votes, but he'd won over 870,000 popular votes. Almost 55% of the votes he got were from southern states, thus validating how popular Fillmore was among the pro-slavery crowd. In no less than 10 slave states, Fremont wasn't even on the ballot and received no votes at all. Still, the results were surprising, and although Fremont didn't win, they were highly encouraging for Republicans. For the first time, a major political party had totally written off the South. None of the usual tricks of trying to balance the ticket with a Southern VP candidate, or nominating a Northerner with Southern views, or running a slaveholder but trying to de-emphasize his ties to slavery. Yet even in a three-way race, Republicans, their first shot at contesting a presidential election, won a third of the popular vote and came within 500,000 votes of the winner. The 1856 election suggested to Republicans that next time, in a two-man race, if the Republican candidate could hold the northern states, the Democrats would botch it by splintering over slavery, which they were already starting to do. And it would help if the Democrat elected in 56, Buchanan, had a bad term in office. This is exactly what happened. Abraham Lincoln, of course, would be the Republicans' nominee in 1860. Buchanan didn't run and was so unpopular that nobody except his wife would have voted for him anyway. That is, if he had a wife, which he didn't because he was probably gay. As for Millard Fillmore, this time he knew he was truly finished. The Whigs were virtually extinct, and the Know-Nothings had lost the battle for up-for-grabs former Whig voters to the Republicans. It turned out that conspiracy theories about Catholics and the Pope just weren't enough to base a national-level political party on, especially when slavery was on the ballot. Fillmore quietly returned to private life in Buffalo. He never ran for anything again. The rest of Fillmore's life was pretty uneventful. In retirement, Fillmore found himself financially insecure. Most U.S. presidents have been wealthy. He's sort of an outlier in that he wasn't. He had his law practice, but not much else. Fillmore was one of the few ex-presidents to get married after he left office. In February 1858, in Albany, New York, Millard Fillmore married Caroline McIntosh, a widow whose first husband, Ezekiel McIntosh, had been president of a small but prosperous railroad company. He died in 1855. The marriage certainly solved Fillmore's financial problems. The couple lived in a well-appointed Victorian house in Buffalo, currently the site of the Statler Hotel. In 1860, the fateful election that brought on the Civil War, Fillmore supported John Bell. He was one of the 3 former Democrats who sought the presidency that year, when the Democratic Party finally splintered. Fillmore could, of course, never dream of supporting an explicitly anti-slavery party. Bell's platform was that the whole country should just stop talking about slavery and ignore it as an issue. Really, that was his platform. He got hosed in the election, of course, as did every candidate whose name was not Abraham Lincoln. The secession crisis began shortly after Lincoln's election. Unlike Franklin Pierce, the next failed president after him, Fillmore was generally tactful in his public statements and actions during the war years, up to a point. Though not a fan of Lincoln, he supported the cause of the Union, raised a symbolic company of volunteers, mostly old men, and did fundraisers for the war effort. He did not support emancipation of the slaves. Then, in 1864, he blew it. At a fundraising event for wounded soldiers, Fillmore spoke strongly against the war, blaming it mostly on abolitionists, who he said goaded Southern fire eaters into supporting secession. He also said the war was bankrupting the country. He didn't care a single whit for formerly enslaved African Americans and their legitimate claim to freedom and citizenship. Shocked, the hometown papers in Buffalo denounced Fillmore. Ink was thrown on his house after Lincoln's assassination in April 1865. After that, Fillmore wisely kept to himself and his philanthropic interests, including the University of Buffalo, which, as you recall, he helped found. He took another trip to Europe. Fillmore was generally in good health until the very end of his life. In March 1874, he suffered a stroke. A few days later, he had a second one. On March 8th, he died at his home in Buffalo. This is Fillmore's grave at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Buffalo. It's the tall, slightly reddish-colored obelisk back there on the hill. His wife, Caroline, lived 7 more years. She died in 1881. His son, Millard Powers Fillmore, died 8 years after that in 1889. He had no children, so there are no direct descendants of Millard Fillmore remaining today. Notably, the son, Millard Powers, had his family's private correspondence burned, thus depriving historians of any evidence of the private and inner life of Fillmore and his family. It might have shed some light on his character and decisions as president. Millard Fillmore was almost forgotten in his own time. Unless you happen to live in Buffalo in the few years after the Civil War, this is a view of the city in 1870, you weren't likely even to know that Fillmore was still alive. But after his death, the true nightmare of obscurity began. His public papers were all published, as all presidents have been, eventually, but histories of the U.S. and the pre-Civil War era accorded him little real estate in terms of page space, and most analyses started and stopped with the Compromise of 1850, with occasional mention that he ran for president as a know-nothing. In this prison of obscurity, Fillmore, especially as time has gone on, has become a natural target of contrarians who seek, overzealously in my view, to rehabilitate his reputation and claim basically, well, he wasn't as bad as you might think. Here is an example of that sort of thing, an article by University of Buffalo political science professor James Campbell, dating from September 2020. Fillmore was in the news then because in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement and the renaming and denaming of monuments named for historical figures with problematic legacies, a building on the University of Buffalo campus had Fillmore's name stripped off of it. The article is basically, but Compromise of 1850! That old chestnut. One of the main bones of contention about Fillmore's legacy is whether he really did believe in those anti-Catholic conspiracy theories and the nativist xenophobia that drove the Know-Nothings and the American Party, or whether, particularly in 1856, he just said he did so he could run for president again. Fillmore's defenders like to claim he wasn't really anti-Catholic, or was just pretending to be a conspiracy theorist so the tinfoil hatters would vote for him. I think the historical evidence is clear of Fillmore's politics, his prejudices, and the beliefs animating his policies as president. He was tolerant of slavery, indifferent to the rights of African Americans, and anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant. I think he really believed those things. And in the end, not only did he stand up again to be counted with the nativists, he wanted to be their leader. During his entire career, Millard Fillmore always had a choice whether to champion true freedom and justice, civil rights and inclusion, and freedom for all. He could never quite bring himself to make that choice. He created his own legacy. It wasn't imposed on him by historians or biographers. Fillmore deserves his reputation. He earned it. There are a few loose ends in Fillmore's story worth talking about. Chief among them was his arch-rival in New York politics, William Seward. It's tempting in this story to cast Fillmore and Seward in the opposite roles, one evil, the other good, but as usual in history, it's not that simple. Seward, ever a political animal, always saw himself as president. He deftly navigated the implosion of the Whig Party in 1854 and 55 by joining the Republicans, coming out as one of their staunchest and most prominent advocates. Seward's hatred of slavery, much in contrast to Fillmore's toleration of it, stood him in good stead in that respect. But despite being the heavy favorite going into the 1860 Republican convention, Seward couldn't get the nomination, which went to Lincoln, whom he thought was far lower in political stature. Nevertheless, Seward campaigned heavily for Lincoln and accepted the job Lincoln offered him as Secretary of State. It almost killed him. On April 14, 1865, while lying in his bed at his house recuperating from a bad carriage accident, Lewis Powell, an associate of John Wilkes Booth, ran into Seward's house with a knife, stabbed him 5 times, and ran away shouting, "I'm mad! I'm mad!" Though weak from loss of blood, Seward survived, though of course Lincoln, shot by Booth at Ford's Theater the same night, wasn't so lucky. Seward remained on in Andrew Johnson's administration, and in 1867 he spearheaded the purchase of Alaska from Russia, which was known as Seward's Folly. He seems to have hoped to stay on in the administration of Johnson's successor, Ulysses Grant, but Grant hated him. Seward traveled extensively in his final years and died back in Auburn, New York in 1872. He is portrayed by David Strathairn in Steven Spielberg's 2012 film Lincoln. Thurlow Weed, the New York political boss who was always at odds with Fillmore, not only transitioned from being a Whig to a Republican, but he actually helped found the party itself in 1854. Weed's newspapers were among the most powerful voices of Republican support in those early years, and he was instrumental in getting the first Republican presidential nomination for John C. Fremont. Though he didn't take a cabinet post or elected office, Weed remained a trusted advisor to Lincoln during the Civil War, often running sensitive or mysterious diplomatic errands for him. They didn't always see eye to eye, but Weed generally avoided denouncing Lincoln in public. He retired to private life in 1867 and died in New York City in 1882. Winfield Scott, who had beaten Fillmore to the Whig presidential nomination in 1852, remained an officer in the U.S. Army. He was still there when the Civil War broke out in 1861. Scott was by this time so old and feeble that there was no real question that he could command armies in the field. But he did draw up a strategic plan called the Anaconda Plan to bottle up the ports of the southern states and slowly strangle the Confederacy of resources. Future Union commanders, especially Ulysses Grant, largely followed this plan. Scott resigned from the Army in October 1861 after the Battle of Bull Run. He remained an unofficial advisor to Union leaders during the war. He died in May 1866 and was buried at the cemetery at West Point. Both the Whig Party and the Know-Nothing Party, or American Party, were basically dead by the time of the Civil War. Slavery had killed them both. The Whigs, who started as the resistance to Andrew Jackson and his heavy-handed policies, had come to champion internal improvements, fiscal responsibility, and conservative foreign policy. Fillmore did, in fact, espouse those principles. For example, he advanced the idea of a transcontinental railroad, though as a practical matter, that idea went nowhere until the Civil War provided the opportunity for it. See my Cult of Technology video for more on that. But in the end, the Whigs just couldn't get past the slavery issue. There were probably more anti-slavery people in the Whig Party than pro-slavery ones, yet both the presidents the party elected were slave owners, and the one anti-slavery candidate they nominated, Scott, got clowned by a pro-slavery Democrat. The Know-Nothings had a different problem. They couldn't get past their xenophobia and nativism. In 1855, with slavery tearing the country apart, that just wasn't going to work as a winning issue at the heart of a national party. Millard Fillmore's dismal showing in 1856 proved that. In 1994, 120 years after Fillmore's death, a cartoonist named Bruce Tinsley launched a satirical comic strip called Millard Fillmore, which was picked up by King Features Syndicate. Featuring a cartoon duck working for a TV station, the strip has nothing whatsoever to do with the real Millard Fillmore, except for the pun on his name. Tinsley, an avowed conservative, used the strip mainly to flog conservative talking points in the 1990s and 2000s, such as global warming denial, opposition to affirmative action, and taxes. The usual complaint about Millard Fillmore isn't its politics, but that it just isn't funny. The irony of the situation, at least with regard to Fillmore, is that today in the 21st century, more Americans have probably read a Millard Fillmore comic strip than know anything about the actual 13th president. Remember Zachary Taylor and the Bowl of Cherries? In the 1980s and 90s, Clara Rising, a former University of Florida English and Humanities professor, not a historian, somehow convinced herself, and a number of others, including a member of Taylor's family, that he might have been poisoned with arsenic. In the summer of 1991, Taylor's remains were exhumed from his grave in Louisville, Kentucky, and subjected to forensic analysis. No evidence of arsenic poisoning was found. A subsequent analysis reconfirmed the 1850 diagnosis, gastroenteritis, its effects probably exacerbated by the snake oil drugs given to Taylor by mid-19th century doctors. Rising was unconvinced, and evidently maintained until her death in 2010 that she still thought Taylor had been poisoned, despite a total lack of evidence. The obvious implication is that if it was murder, Fillmore did it, or perhaps Fillmore together with Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and others who wanted to see the Compromise of 1850 passed. I think this gives Millard Fillmore far too much credit. He was a milquetoast and rather dull politician, not a ruthless one. There's no evidence anywhere in his background, or in his whole career, to suggest that he would have been capable of murdering someone, much less the President of the United States, to achieve a political objective. If he had done it, he sure as hell wasn't smart enough to get away with it. Responsible history must be based on evidence. Given the complete lack of evidence that Zachary Taylor was murdered, and indeed considerable evidence to the contrary, Clara Rising's theory is just not supportable. And it remains, perhaps ironically given the framing of this story, nothing more than a baseless conspiracy theory, the opposite of documentary history. Millard Fillmore was one of the least distinguished and least successful presidents of the United States. He had no broad vision for the country and failed to appreciate the implications of the nation's biggest problem at that time, slavery. An analysis of his political career, particularly its beginning and its ending, shows that, above all, he was consumed with jealousy and paranoia about a class of Americans he didn't like and thought was destroying the country. He emerged from an undistinguished field of feckless and craven politicians who were in charge of the nation's affairs in the decades before the Civil War, and who managed to bungle nearly everything they touched. Maybe some other guy couldn't have done much better. I don't know, but I think we can conclude, on balance, that Millard Fillmore made American history worse. If you liked this video, please hit the like button, share it, do all the stuff you normally do for a video you like. As you probably know by now, there's a members section on my YouTube channel, which you can join for $5 a month. There you'll find an ad-free version of this video with none of the redactions that I occasionally have to do on the free version of the channel. The sources I used to make this video are listed in credits at the end and also down below in the description. Please do check them out. There's some really great stuff there. As usual, I want to say that no part of this video, including the research or the writing of the script or the images, was done with AI. The history of humans should be written by humans, not machines. My crime novel that came out in December 2024, The Gangster Crown, is available on Amazon Kindle and in paperback. The link to that is in the description. I also put out a mystery called Daniel Vanished. I am going to have a book out in 2026. Keep watching my channel for details on that. I teach history classes online at my website, seanmunger.com, and you can sign up for my blog at gardenofmemory.net and get the columns delivered directly to your email. Thank you to all my fans and supporters, and thank you once again for joining me on another journey into the past.